My dogs.
They are two?
Yep.
Let me just see if this will start. So I have the commentary available, but if any person dares to misbehave, I will cut the word for sure. But okay, so we are already live. We shall start. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning also for those that are now following us on my YouTube channel from the Americas, and Dobre din for all those following us on Russia, not only in Russia, but also in other Russian-speaking countries. My today's guest is a Canadian citizen, born actually on the same day of my youngest son, which is June the 14th. You don't know that, but it's a curiosity. It wasn't for that reason that I invited her to join us today. Anyway, she's also an independent journalist, and she has been particularly active, at least over the last decade, covering events in places where usually Western societies do not show much interest about or are highly influenced by particular agendas. I started following her when I first heard her participation on the United Nations press briefing on Syria. I don't know when it actually took place, but I do know it was held a long time ago. Since then, I searched for more of her work, and I found out that back then she had already left us a great legacy regarding investigative journalism. For example, concerning Palestine, I suggest you to search for all the work she produced so far. I don't know if she remembers the conference that was about to be held in Southampton back to 2016 and had to be cancelled because it was related with the existence of the state of Israel. I'm planning to organize something like that here in Lisbon, even if it is organized online through stream, but we are thinking about it in the future. Actually, she also made an impressive job on Syria, also in North Korea, and in addition to many other places, now she has been more recently covering the reality on Ukraine. She has been a very important voice to be heard over the years for many particular reasons. First, she goes to the places where action is happening. And second, she contacts with real people, she witnesses events on the ground, and she has direct contact with documents. It's quite an honor for me to have her with us this afternoon. So, ladies and gentlemen, Eva Karene Bartlett, say hello to her, and please participate, sending your commentary, maybe your impressions of her work as well, and also regarding Ukraine. So, dear Eva, firstly, thank you so much for accepting to be with us today. When I told my regular audience I was starting to bring guests to help us think about international events, I had already thought on you. However, many from my audience promptly said, please bring Eva Karene Bartlett here. And this sure means you have quite a legion of fans within Portuguese-speaking communities like Portugal, Brazil, and Angola. Let me ask you, is this the first time you visit Portugal, so to speak?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for your very kind and generous introduction, and thank you to your viewers, your followers, who know of me and maybe what you were saying about them asking for me to come on. Thank you. I actually was in Portugal many years ago. I lived in France for a year during university, and so I did quite a bit of traveling in Europe at that time. So I don't remember that many places. I was in Sintra. I found it quite a beautiful area. And I really enjoyed it. My time in Portugal, it was very brief, but maybe a week or so. But yeah, so this is my second time.
All right, nice to know, although it is virtually, but at least you have this second time, which is quite a unique way to visit our country too. So over the last months, you've spent a lot of time in the Donbass. When was your first time, and what Donbass have you found?
I first went to the Donetsk People's Republic. I didn't make it to the Lugansk People's Republic in September 2019. Now, just a little bit of context, I started going to Syria in April 2014 and became quite tunnel visioned because it's kind of out of necessity when you're on the ground with limited time and limited internet. You're focusing on, what the interviews you're doing and what you're seeing and hearing and all that and getting it out, especially if you're working independently and you have to do, all the editing and subtitling and all that yourself, and the writing, of course, and the research. So I say that because I just want to give the context that while I was aware vaguely what was happening in the Donbass, I was very tunnel visioned on Syria and still on Palestine as well. But over the years, I was, following what was happening in the Donbass and decided finally in September 2019, I was able to go there for my first time. So I went there for 3 weeks. I went to villages near Gorlevka that were being pounded by Ukrainian shelling in violation, of course, of the Minsk Accords with heavy weaponry. I spoke with residents. You can find these interviews on my YouTube. I had a very nice Donbass local, Dmitry Astrakhan, come with me, and he was acting as my translator, and he was also very informative, giving me, a lot of information about the area that I wouldn't have known otherwise. And through him, I was able to speak with the mostly elderly residents that were living in places like Zaitsevo and other areas around Gorlivka, and hear about their torment, their suffering under Ukrainian shelling. So that was in 2019. I moved to Russia last year. That's a whole story in itself. I'm very happy that I did move here. But when I moved here last year, I did inquire about going back to the Donbass, but due to COVID regulations, I was told that only residents of the Donbass were being allowed in. Now, I don't know, the reasons behind that, but I did try to go back. And then I went back this year. And so I've been there a total of 7 times. Now, this year, each time I've gone, with the exception of one time, I went in March with the Ministry of Defense delegation. There were Western media on that delegation. It wasn't that they were only, allowing people that had views that might align with Russia. And no, to the contrary, they invited French mainstream media to go. And so I did follow up on their report and found it absolutely unsurprisingly shoddy and omitting key factors like 8 years of Ukraine's war on the Donbass and everything that we saw and heard. But anyway, with the exception of that visit, all my visits, the 5 other visits there this year have been for 3 weeks, and then I come back to my home because you'll probably see my dogs pop into the camera view at some point. One of them's down here taking up my right hand attention. So I can only go away for as long as I have dog care. So I tend to spend 3 weeks down in the Donbass and then come back there and come back. So my last time I left sometime around November 23rd or something, and I am planning to go back quite soon.
And by the way, when I first went to Kiev, my impression was that many people felt offended when I tried to speak Russian with them, although it's a very speaking language in Ukraine. But I thought that reaction, harsh reaction, was kind of a bit strange. I know that it was after the Euromaidan, but did you have this kind of impression and sensitivity in the Donbass? Have you been to Kiev also, or any other cities, or not really?
So I have been to Kiev, or Kiev as we say in English, and I went in, I want to say it was 2019. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I feel like it was February 2019. It was, if you remember the name of the journalist and editor of RA Novosti, Kirill Vyshinsky, he was he's Ukrainian. He also holds Russian citizenship now, but he is Ukrainian by birth. And he was imprisoned by the Ukrainian authorities in 2018. Yes. So when I went to Kiev, it would have been 2018 as well. Or no, I'm sorry. It would have been 2019. There we go. Anyway, he was wrongly imprisoned because 4 years prior, in 2014, as an editor, he had published 14 or 15 articles, not written by him, written by other people with differing views on the events in Maidan in Kiev at that time, in Odessa, etc. And so there were some views that would have been supportive of what was happening, the coup in Ukraine, and there were some that would have been against. But the point being, he was an editor and he published these 4 years later, the Ukrainian state decided that he was a traitor. He was a danger to the state. They locked him up, held him for exactly, I don't remember, but it was near a year and a half, never giving him a trial. He was held in pretrial detention for that time in terrible conditions. And so when I went to Kiev, I met with his lawyer, Andrei Domansky. I spent 3 days there, and I have to say, I took precautions when I went there because I was warned, I do contribute op-eds to RT. I, at the time, was also writing for Mint Press News and some Canadian independent media. But at the time I was told, Eva, your name is kind of known. You do write for RT. It could be dangerous for you to go there. Please don't go there. And I said, well, I want to meet this lawyer and interview him. I had by email interviewed Kirill, obviously with the help of a translator. But I just thought I always think it's important to go to, the places and talk to people. So I did go there for 3 days. I didn't take my laptop. I just took a phone. I did the interview with Domansky in a hotel and sent the interview files, just the raw files, via Dropbox to a couple of friends I trusted, just in case anything were to happen. So, all that to say, I didn't have any bad experience. So I'm happy to say so, but it could have been otherwise. And I did take precautions in case the Kiev authorities decided to stop me at the airport or stop me at any point. I've faced a lot of dangers in my time, from Gaza to Syria to the Donbass. And generally, I'm just not tooting my horn. I'm just I've become accustomed to shelling. In Gaza, I used to be fired at with live ammunition by Israeli soldiers, literally so close that you could hear the sound of the bullets whizzing past. This is when I and other activists were working with farmers and accompanying them on their land, where Israel enacts a policy of brutal harassment against the farmers, maiming and killing them. Anyway, all that to say, I'm accustomed to danger. I'm accustomed to facing it. And I don't know, I've developed this weird calm that comes over me when I am in the face of some sort of danger, whether it's bombing or otherwise. But when I went to Kiev, I was it was more of it was freaky because I didn't know what the outcome would be. So that's the only time I've been there. After going to Crimea and to the Donbass in 2019, I was put on Myrotvorets, which I'm sure everybody knows of by now, Ukraine's kill list. So needless to say, I can't go back there now, particularly since I now live in Russia. So I haven't been to other cities, to answer your question, other than in the Donbass proper.
Okay, actually, you talked about, you mentioned the Myrotvorets list, which was my following question. But many people here in the West tend to downgrade this portal, suggesting it is just a list to let people know who is an active part of Russian disinformation strategy to the West. However, at Myrotvorets, those added to the list are usually labeled as threats to national security in Ukraine. Do you actually think that this is just an information portal, a very naive information portal, or actually, at least it reminds me, when someone is labeled a threat to national security of any country, it suggests the creation of a kill list, or at least a list of people to be harassed by unknown people, by the John Does of these societies. Even Elon Musk had no clue of what was it all about soon after he was added to the list. Can you actually explain exactly on what is this Myrotvorets? And do you feel, you already said that you are not going to Ukraine, of course, for many reasons, because you know that it's highly likely that they not only harass you, but that they arrest you, or even happen something not good. But do you feel threatened, besides that, by this step taken by the Ukrainians behind this?
So it was created in 2014. Now, I should know this guy's name by now, but anyway, the guy involved in co-creating it was a member of the Ukrainian government. Maybe it was he was a minister of something, maybe internal affairs or something like that. And the thing, I'm aware that people downplay it and say, no, this is, like you say, it's just a list of people who are Russian propagandists. Although, by the way, it does include 327 children, the youngest of which was 9 or 10 years old when she was put on the list. So, I mean, that in itself is a very disturbing fact. it also, aside from people like myself and Roger Waters and briefly Elon Musk and various Western journalists or politicians or people who have spoken out in any capacity about Ukraine's Ukraine's corruption, Ukraine's war on the Donbass, et cetera, get put on this list. But also, I when I first wrote about it a couple of years ago or more, I remember when I was researching it, that's how I came across, who was behind founding it. I read the names of several Ukrainians themselves, among them journalists, members of parliament, who had been put on the list and then had been assassinated after their names, and if their information, like their address is known, their phone number, their address, that's all put on it. If their passport is known, it's put on there. So it's hard to argue at this point, especially unfortunately after the tragic assassination of Daria Dugina, who was a beautiful, intelligent young Russian philosopher and journalist and very outspoken young woman. And she was killed in a car bombing many months ago in Moscow. And after her murder, her entry on Myrotvorets was, they put a cross through it, and she was marked as liquidated. And this is, they whoever's, still running this site, they brag about it. If you go to the front page of their site, you'll see scenes of murdered Russians, also Ukrainians, but you see scenes of murdered people, and so they're literally bragging about these deaths. So I think it's more grasping at straws to say it's not a kill list. In any case, whatever the intent behind the people who are running it, for me, I don't know. I mean, in Russia, I don't have a car. So, if I did have a car, I would be looking under it every day for any sort of strange devices, as people I know in Donbass do, journalists I know. I don't have a car, and I don't really have a predictable schedule. I have my 2 guard dogs, so I guess I feel maybe a false sense of security. I don't know. I'm not too concerned here. However, if I was to go back to Canada, then I would worry, because it's well known that Canada, back in the, after World War II, Canada brought over something like 2,000 Ukrainian Nazis, allowed them to stay, were given citizenship. Our Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, is herself very much a Ukrainian nationalist, very supportive of the Banderites, of the Nazis in Ukraine. And CBC back in June did a hit piece on me, smear, and I don't care. Like, I really don't care what people call me. Basically, you can call me anything you want to. It's not going to change what I say, because I know I'm speaking truth. I'm not saying I have all the truth and all the facts. I'm saying what I say is based on truth. Anyway, so I don't care what people call me. But the fact is, when CBC did their smear, which was actually so badly done, it actually brought more supporters to me. Including one gentleman who donates to me on Patreon, and he doubled his donation, which is already quite generous, because he said that the journalist that did the smear really annoyed him. But the flip side of that is, these some of these Ukrainian nationalists that might tune into CBC who didn't know who Eva Bartlett is now might. And were I to go back to Canada, it could pose a risk to me. I don't know what they would do. I don't believe the government would protect me. I think that if anything were to happen to me, it would be written off as an accident or a one-off, or, lone wolf or whatever. So in that regard, it could be risky for me.
Still, you keep your courageous. You keep being courageous on the ground, and you still don't quit to go there, which actually is quite an example to give to many other people who usually probably would freak out if it happened to that kind of regular citizen. However, for example, yesterday I was watching, or even today I was watching yesterday's news in Portugal, and they were showing a video of the Kraken regiment, usually presenting them as being the freedom fighters, all those labels we know usually they put on these kind of groups. However, we know what Kraken regiment is. And back to 2020, I had the honor and the privilege to participate on a piece by one of our best newspapers in Portugal regarding Ukraine being a nest of neo-Nazi followers all over Europe, including in Portugal. Back then, it was considered to be a nest of Nazis. I searched also for news, and in 2016, Human Rights Watch made a piece on the threats against journalists in Ukraine, especially by far-right movements. The same goes for the UN. What has changed actually that now all these groups like the Azov Battalion, the Kraken Regiment, they are actually seen as freedom fighters, as heroes, almost the same way as the white helmets were also labeled on Syria?
Yeah, but just before you said the white helmets, I was thinking, I'm going to mention the fact that this is the same playbook as in Syria. In Syria, at the beginning of the global war on Syria in 2011, nobody, a lot of people didn't understand what was going on. They thought it was really a nonviolent, unarmed revolution. Of course, that has been much disproven pretty immediately on. But anyway, and so the same media that are lauding now openly brazen Nazis in Ukraine did the same with lauding Al-Qaeda in Syria. You can still find media that will call al-Nusra or whatever they're rebranded, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they'll call them rebels. And it's just like, these are literally Al-Qaeda. They have the values of Al-Qaeda, and who are supposed to be the West's mortal enemy. But of course, we know that we fund them and train them and whitewash their crimes. So it's not surprising that that's my pup, sorry. It's not surprising that now the narrative has shifted, because you're right. I'm sure everybody's by now seen these memes showing a variety of international media talking about Nazis in Ukraine, Ukraine's far right problem, Ukraine's neo-Nazi problem, right? And then come February 2022, it's changed. Like, no, and so in fact, the CBC smear, one of the things they did is they took an interview I had with a woman I'd met in Mariupol, and this woman spoke English. So I was like, oh, thank goodness, because I don't have to subtitle. And so it was in a church in Mariupol. We were just standing outside a church in Mariupol, and I spoke with her, and I don't like to prompt people. I just ask them questions and let them talk about what they want to talk about. And I can't remember exactly how the conversation ensued, but at one point she said, we want to liberate our territory, our area of these crazy people. And I asked her, who are the crazy people? And she said, some people call them Nazis. And so CBC took issue with that, which I think is one of the reasons their smear on me backfired, because everybody knows there's Nazis in Ukraine. And CBC was like, oh, conspiracy theorist Eva Bartlett thinks there's Nazis in Ukraine. It's just like, and in fact, I was just looking through CBC's archives last night to see if I could find any mention of Azov Nazis. And I didn't have a whole lot of luck on CBC, although I wasn't very patient either. But certainly in other Canadian media, you can find it. In fact, a lot of articles like, why is Canada training Ukraine's far right? Or, oops, Canadian forces embarrassed about the photo op with the IDAR or whatever, Azov IDAR battalion. So there's a lot of documentation, not only of being aware of the Nazis, but actually that, for example, in Canada's case, that we've been funding them and training them. But yeah, why is it changed now? Because it's, again, back to the whole, and not just Syria, but Libya, et cetera, every time. And actually, Colonel Douglas, I think it was he who said it, Colonel Douglas McGregor, I believe, said it recently. I was listening to one of his recent interviews, and it's something I say a lot too. And it's like, when the West wants to impose a regime change or whatever the operation is at hand, they first have to vilify the leadership of the enemy, right? And in that case, Assad was called every name in the book. So is Putin. And then at the same time, they laud the actual villains, the actual, I don't want to say evil people, but the actual sociopaths that are killing people are lauded and whitewashed. So that's why, we're not hearing so much about Nazis in Ukraine now. And that's why, Chrystia Freeland in February actually was standing there with a Slava Ukraine banner in, I don't know if it was Ottawa or Toronto, and media. Now, I don't know if it was BBC or it was some other mainstream media. This happened more than once, actually, where they have footage of soldiers with the whichever Nazi insignia on their arm, and they just kind of Photoshop or whatever them out, because oops, and that happened also in Syria. There was a British guy, John something or other, and he was embedded with ISIS. I can't remember how he got to be there, but anyway, in one of his reports, he said that the white helmets are known as ISIS's rescuers or something like that. And that was kind of like an oopsie, because whichever media aired that, Channel 4 or the BBC, was kind of like, uh-oh, how do we handle this? But anyway, It's just, there's so many parallels.
One of the most contemporary examples I can find is the Kosovo Liberation Army, which actually faced exactly the same that we've been talking about until now. At first, they were considered terrorists, and then suddenly, well, we have to support these freedom fighters. But by the way, do you believe that the West, because of all this that we have been talking about, do you believe that the West pushed Russia and Ukraine for this conflict? And do you think that this is actually some kind of proxy war?
I do believe the West pushed this conflict, and at the same time, I believe Russia was doing whatever it could to de-escalate until the very last minute. Russia was trying to push for some sort of negotiation, some sort of way to resolve the conflict. But there's a variety of factors. Like I always, if people listen to me in other interviews, I'm sorry that I repeat myself, but I do like to recommend an article written by Jacques Baude, or I guess originally it would have been in either French or German. He's Swiss, but anyway, it's been translated into English. It's on thepostil.com. And the thing I like about the article is that, well, number one, he's former intelligence. So he's not like a Russian asset. He's literally former Swiss intelligence that worked, I think, with British intelligence as well. But also he gives the chronology of how things came to be. So when I say it, well, Eva's just a Russian propagandist, but here's this actual like Swiss dude that's saying like, here's what happened in the months prior to Russia commencing its special military operation. This is what was happening, including in early 2022, Ukraine increasing its shelling of the Donbass. Media don't talk about that, just like they don't talk about the 8 years of Ukraine's war on the Donbass prior to February 2022. And he also talks about how Russia was trying to come to some sort of negotiations, trying to basically say, NATO, stop expanding eastward, stop, threatening Russia. And the West didn't, they pushed for the war. So, and that is also, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I'm fairly certain that is also basically what Colonel McGregor would say, Scott Ritter as well. Yeah, so I do believe the West pushed for this, and as I said, Russia was trying to avoid it at all possible cost. But now they're in the position where the West continues to push for it. I think Russia would be willing to negotiate, maybe not to back. I don't like to speculate, but I would say Russia's probably always willing to negotiate, but definitely in this case, not to retreat from areas it's helped the Donbass liberate.
That would actually wouldn't make any sense to get back to previous 2014 borders. But by the way, what to say about Angela Merkel's recent interview concerning the Minsk agreements?
I actually haven't heard the interview. I've been a little bit like tunnel visioned again, working on my footage and subtitling. Maybe
it was on the news on the German newspaper, where she actually said the Minsk agreements were made only to give Ukraine some time.
Yeah. And also Poroshenko, in somewhat recent months, also said Ukraine never intended to adhere to the agreements. So well, I mean, that just ties in with the whole, like, the West was always pushing for something with Russia. I remember in 2019 when I went to these villages I mentioned at the beginning, the people I was interviewing, well, there are some notable things since we already talked about the Nazi problem in Ukraine. A number of times people I interviewed would say, like, what do people in Canada think about the Nazis in Ukraine? I said, they don't know. Most of them don't know because of our media. But they would also, even, back then, they'd say, like, no, there's no way we want to be part of Ukraine again. Ukraine is bombing us. Why would we want to be part of Ukraine? So then fast forward to this September. Now, when the referendum occurred in the Donbass, I didn't know. I thought it was going to be later. I thought it would be in November or something. So it was pure fluke that I happened to already be in Donetsk when the referendum began. And September 22nd or 3rd, I think.
23.
Yeah. So it was very fortunate that I was there, because I was able to do what I prefer to do and go around on my own. I went with a few other journalists to areas of Donetsk. We went to Kievsky, which is a really hard hit area in the north of the city that is pounded by Ukrainian shelling all the time. I went to Kirovsky, so a western district, also pounded all the time. Where else did we go? We went to anyway, we went to a central Donetsk district. I went to the same day, I went to Mariupol, where voting was taking place. The next day I went to Gorlovka, and then in subsequent days I went to Makivka, east of Donetsk. And so until the fifth day, the voting was taking place house to house, and volunteers were going house to house or apartment to apartment, because most people tend to live in apartments. And they were knocking on doors, and if people wanted to vote, they could. They weren't being forced. I know the Western media was saying, oh, they had a gun to their head. My reply to that is, yeah, the gun to their head was 8 years of Ukraine's bombing them. I actually have a really cute, I think it's cute, footage from Makivka showing people coming out of the apartment, and in this case a table was set up and outside the apartment, and people coming out, and there were Donbass, one or two Donbass soldiers standing at a distance back, with their gun, just standing there, not really interacting with the people, except when this one older woman pushed her little toddler to go take a piece of candy from the soldier. And I was just like, yeah, that's really what you do. You push a kid that you value, your precious toddler, grandchild, you push them to a menacing soldier, right? Like, obviously this woman was not threatened by the presence of these soldiers, nor was anybody I spoke with. And in fact, I started, because I saw the way media was slanting, I started asking them, is anybody forcing you to vote? Are you intimidated by the presence of these soldiers over there? And they're like, no, they're one of us, they're protecting us. So there's that. But then, yeah, people I would speak with during the referendum, they'd say, like, we've been waiting for this for 8 years. So I'm sorry, that's kind of a waffling reply, but I can't remember how I got off on that tangent. But the point being, there's no way they wanted to be, it was your question about Merkel and Minsk. And yeah, throughout the time I have spent in the Donbass, it's been very clear to me that the people did want to join Russia and why they want to join Russia. And now that we learned things like, well, they never intended to adhere to Minsk. And also, when areas of the DPR and LPR were liberated, in many occasions, offices where the OSCE offices were, it was found, like, just many files that reports that were written but were never submitted, that would have incriminated Ukraine for violating the accords. So there's a lot to be said.
Actually, it's quite interesting that you mentioned that, because I've been following some pieces by the Washington Post, which was actually quoting some researchers and some polls held in the Donbass, and most of them actually said that the majority of the people from the Donbass were in favor of at least leaving Ukraine, and regardless of becoming an independent country or to be part of Russia. This was the majority opinion. And now suddenly a lot of people say, oh, the referendums were flawed because it didn't respect the Western standards. It needed the United Nations mission to be there to cover up. And you were there, you witnessed this process. So what concretely does, in your opinion, was it a valid and totally transparent process that was followed there?
What I saw was, yes, I mean, I wasn't omnipresent, but so the other thing to note about it was they had sealed, and I looked very carefully at the ballot boxes. They were very tightly sealed, impossible to tamper with. If you open them, that was it. You couldn't reseal them the way that they were fastened. They had transparent sealed voting boxes. And I did go to a school on the final day. Voting took place for the most part in schools, maybe other venues where larger numbers of people could come. And I did go and see that on the fifth day, in 3 or so schools around Donetsk neighborhoods. And then after 4 p.m., I went back to a school near where I was staying. I was renting a very simple apartment in that district. So I went back to this school, which, by the way, had been hit by Ukrainian grads back in May or so and badly damaged. And 1 or 2 people were killed in that school, not children, thankfully, but still adults. So I went back to that school, and they took the large ballot boxes, carried them over and emptied them out onto the table. And then the voting commission were around, and they did their thing, like gathering the ballots and counted them. So, I mean, that was pretty transparent. The other aspect was, and I'm not an expert by any means on voting in the US, but I know a lot of people have commented, hey, we should do that in the US. And that is, people had to present ID, which was then cross-referenced with the voting list of people who were eligible to vote, right? So, and they had to show that they lived in this district and that they were eligible to vote in this district. So they couldn't go to multiple districts and vote. So they had to present their ID, their name was checked off. And then the only thing that I know people in the West would be like, oh, it was, they didn't have privacy, so therefore they were intimidated. In many cases I saw there wasn't. Like the first one I saw, they took like a binder and put it like that so that the people, not just, but the first one was man casting his vote, had a modicum of privacy. The fifth day, when the voting took place in schools, etc., there were actual like booths with curtains they could go into. But what I saw was like people didn't care about the privacy because it was clear what everybody wanted. So like the whole necessity for privacy is a moot point to me. In my opinion, it just didn't matter because it was so clear.
You know what? Actually, what you described is exactly our election process in Portugal. We just don't sign any paper demonstrating that we are that elector, that voter, but we have to show our ID, and only after that we go to the booth to vote and put the vote. Everything is exactly like you said, and we are unable to go to any other assembly to formalize the vote again. So what you described is exactly our process, our electoral process here in Portugal. So it's a new country. You don't question if it is a democracy or not. It seems quite fair that you had the observers on the ground like you that witnessed everything that happened. But by the way, do you think that, on your opinion, which mistakes did Russia made over the last 8 years? What could have Moscow done better in order to don't reach this point, this status we are facing now?
That's a hard question because I'm not aware of all the factors behind the scenes of what Moscow did and didn't do. I know from the Donbass perspective, people wished that Russia had come to their assistance earlier. Now I know how especially on Twitter, it's obnoxious how the West frames it as Russia having invaded in 2014. From my experience in 2019, when I was there, I did not see Russian troops, and people I spoke with did not say that there was Russian troops there. I met one Russian volunteer who formerly was in the Russian military, finished his service and went to volunteer in the Donbass. And I asked him why. He said, because I don't want this coming to Russia. And I think also he had empathy for what was happening, the people of the Donbass under Ukrainian fire. But other than that, I didn't see Russian troops in the Donbass. So I'm just saying that to counter the narrative that Russia invaded in 2014. Also, that Jack Bode article, either that or a subsequent one he wrote, makes the point there were at most like 50 Russian volunteers. Again, these would have been people that went of their own accord to the Donbass. But from the perspective of the people, I think that a lot of them were saying, like, why didn't Russia come and save us? Why didn't they, annex, allow us to hold a referendum to join like Crimea did? As far as other, I don't know. It's funny, like, you watch Russian diplomats and you see them say, referring to the American diplomats and say our American friends, which is just always kind of like, why in the world would you call them friends? Because they're some of the most obnoxious diplomats in the world. They get up and walk out when you or Syrian representatives are speaking at the UN. But I think that's the thing about Russian diplomacy, is that they're always willing to talk. In my opinion, even though I don't follow it that carefully, but from what I've seen, they're always willing to talk and try to come to some sort of, have a discussion rather. What they could have done better, I don't know, because I think also from what I understand, in 2014, I've heard the analysis that Russia wasn't really in the position to do much more at that time, bearing in mind they were heavily invested in Syria as of 2015. So I don't really know how else to answer your question, to be honest.
I know it's not rhetoric, but you don't have quite exactly a proper answer to give to this. It's just a hint, because now it's easy to say, what did Russia make that shouldn't have been done back then? Now it's easier. 8 years after the events, it's all way much easier. But much of the news here in the European Union, despite the fact that they censor the Russian channels and some Russian media. I used to have here RT, Russia Today, and also the RTR Planeta, which is quite the same as Russia 24 channel. But despite that, here in the EU, they share images of what they call mass graves and torture chambers that show Russian participation in war crimes and crimes against humanity. By the way, most people don't know, but International Criminal Court doesn't have any jurisdiction to cover any kind of events here in Ukraine, because the International Criminal Court only investigates crimes allegedly committed by Russia and also by the People's Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk. So they expressly put aside crimes committed by Ukrainians all over these years. So this is unlawful. But what can you say about these mass graves, these torture chambers that we know from the Western news?
Well, I'm sorry about my involuntary laugh there when you mentioned mass grave. It's just, I can't believe they're still pushing that. That's why I laughed, because back in, I think it was April, is when I first started hearing Western media talking about a region called Mangush or Manhush, depending on your dialect, west of Mariupol, yeah. And they were saying, like, they were quoting the former mayor of Mariupol, Vadim Boychenko, I think his name is, as saying, this is the worst war crime of the 21st century. There's up to 10,000 people buried in mass graves 30 meters wide, these pits 30 meters wide, and the people are thrown in there, and the Russians are burying their war crimes. And it's just like, okay, so I went with RT journalist Roman Kosarov and his film crew, and we drove there. Nobody stopped us from entering the premises, which, you know, if it really was a crime scene that Russia was trying to cover us stuff up, even though Roman is RT, you know, there would be limits. They'd be like, okay, no, dude, you're not coming in here because this is our secret little crime scene. Nobody stopped us. And it turned out it was an existing cemetery that was expanding. And it certainly did not have pits 30 meters wide. It had like orderly rows of individual plots. Roughly between 300 and 400 new plots in, like, the existing cemetery was here, and then new plots in rows. So there was like rows of 3 or 4, and then rows of 2, and like just under 100 of those rows those plots were empty. So they were awaiting deceased. So that was back in April, and actually while we were there, 2 men that were 2 grave diggers showed up, and so we spoke with them, or rather Roman asked them questions, and they were like, no, we've buried everyone here. We, you know, if we have their information, we put their name and date of birth and date of death. If we have that, if we don't, you know, we just unfortunately have to put a number. But they were like, no, we're not, there's nobody buried in mass graves. And then when I was back in the DPR this November, I saw this again in the news, except they're now saying mass burial sites. And so they mentioned Mangush. They said it's expanding, and it's like, I don't know the number they gave for Mangush. And then they mentioned 2 other areas, Vinohradny and Stary Krim. So I called the taxi driver I know. I said, let's go. And we drove to Stary Krim, which I later learned is one of the largest cemeteries in Europe. So the media was describing it as a mass burial site, and, you know, like the implication being Russia is killing people in Mariupol right now, and they're being secretly buried in this mass burial site, which is a field. And it wasn't. It was an existing cemetery with a church. And the plots at the edge of the cemetery are in a field technically, but it's a cemetery, you know. And there was an older man being buried. I don't know how he died, but he was recently deceased, so old age or illness. And I took a photo from a distance, but they were like, you know, please don't take a photo. This is private for us. I'm like, of course. But I did just from a distance, just to show that this activity was going on. And there was a funeral taking place near the church also while I was there. And then there was some older couple that were paying their respects to their grandchild who had died back in March. And what I think happened, because they were very emotional, so they allowed me, and there are 2 other Russian photographers there, so I chatted with them a bit, but they allowed us to photo, but they weren't up for an interview. But what I assume happened is that, you know, the child was killed in fighting. Who was responsible, I can't say. What I can say is, and it's well known by now, is that when Ukrainian forces, including Azov, embedded with the Ukrainian army, were occupying areas of Mariupol, and they did this throughout the Donbass. They often occupied residential buildings, upper floors of residential buildings, and kept civilians in bottom floors, using them as human shields, firing from those buildings, often drawing fire upon themselves. And as a consequence, there will be civilians caught in crossfire. There were many other instances where Ukrainian forces themselves were firing on the buildings. And I know this happened, for example, in Volnovakha, the hospital there that was destroyed. I was back there in September, I think, and spoke with staff there. And they said before any Russian forces, any Donbass forces entered Volnovakha, Ukrainian forces were firing in the hospital. They were shelling the hospital. So there's a lot of precedents. I remember being in Rubizhny in the Lugansk People's Republic. The fighting was still going on. It was about 1.5 kilometers away from where I was with some other journalists. We were at a school which was being used to house displaced people who had come from what was then the front line where the fighting was occurring. And we heard similar stories of them being kept against their will in their apartment buildings by the Ukrainian forces. And when I was in Rubizhny and also in Mariupol back in April, you would see little graves, in amongst the apartment buildings. And this would have been people burying wherever they could their loved ones who had died of whatever cause. So my assumption, this little girl who's back in the Stary Krim mass burial site cemetery, she would have died, been killed in fighting back in March, and only recently was exhumed and moved to this cemetery. And I think that was the case with other recent plots, is that they were exhumed from wherever they would have been buried. But, beyond that, I can't say. But the whole implication that this is a mass burial site is just ridiculous. Somebody who follows me on Twitter, I don't remember the person's name, was like, well, in my Western town, 500, I can't remember what he said, but like, for example, like in my town, a city of 500,000, like 400 or 500 people a month would die, or something like that. He's making the point that the numbers that the media are claiming have died in the space of X number of months are not that much more than in a normal city.
Yes, it depends of the proportion, regardless of the size of the demography there on that place. But I saw your video there on these so-called mass graves, actually with the identification of those who died. So it doesn't make actually any sense that if it was intended to kill those people that are buried there, to identify them, you probably would want to hide the crimes you have committed. That's why sometimes I wonder, and I don't know if you have any hint on this about Bucha and the Mariupol theater. Do you have any data or any evidence, anything that can at least let us understand what happened there?
So Bucha isn't something I've done like a serious investigation into. I know many others have. I would highly recommend Brian Berletic of the New Atlas. I know he's done at least 2, if not more, video analysis of the facts that we were presented and, why the Ukrainian and Western narrative is impossible. I know the basics about that would be that when Russia left that area, then the mayor of Bucha was like posting a grinning selfie saying, we're here, and no mention whatsoever of a trail of bodies on the main street of that city. And I believe, if I recall, those bodies were only talked of like many days after Russian troops had left, which just is illogical. So why did the mayor and other people in that city wait several days or more until they talked about it? Why did, on the day that he posted his grinning selfie video, why did he not make any mention of it? How is it possible that Russia killed those bodies if Russian troops had already left? There's the French, I think he was a medic, Adrien Bouquet. He was in Bucha. And again, I gotta make a note to myself to actually go back to his interview, because it was a while back, but he definitively states, that what he saw doesn't align with what the Ukrainian narrative was saying. And as for the Mariupol drama theater, I also, unfortunately, haven't done a serious investigation into that. I have seen the theater. In fact, when I was in Mariupol again in November, I saw it. It's being worked on. It's being repaired, I should say. But not being a weapons expert, I can't say the nature of the bombing, but I know I've heard that it doesn't coincide with what the Ukrainians were saying was an airstrike, I believe. And we know, especially myself, I know from Syria, the West will invent any number of stories about hospitals being bombed or not bombed, or something else, that they will just invent a story that never happened, or maybe there's a kernel of truth to it, but they leave out certain factors. And so I wouldn't put it past them to have done the same thing with Mariupol theater. And I'll just make it one point. Now, I know my detractors, like Snopes and Channel 4 and all that, took issue with me saying the Quds hospital in Aleppo was not destroyed. And I think when I initially said it, I think it was in the context of, perhaps it was in the context of that UN panel that you mentioned earlier, where I had a back and forth in the Q&A with this pompous Norwegian twerp journalist, and I pointed out to him, like, look, you keep talking about sources on the ground, but you don't have any, because there are no Western sources on the ground. You're literally relying on Al-Qaeda, that you're calling a media activist or whatever. But it was either in that reply to him that I spoke about the Quds hospital, or was it later? I don't remember at this point, but I actually went to the Quds hospital and it wasn't destroyed. And we had, like, I think Médecins Sans Frontières, one of those groups, saying, oh, it's been completely destroyed, completely, like, reduced to dust or whatever. So that's an example of something where there might have been a kernel of truth in that. For example, it could have been hit by what nature of what weapon or by whom, I don't know, but it wasn't reduced to dust or whatever it was they said. And the other point being, like, for example, the children in Eye Hospital in Aleppo that was badly damaged, what the media didn't talk about was how it was used as a headquarters by the various terrorist factions, including ISIS. And they had a prison, including torture rooms below, so those are factors they don't mention. As for Russian torture rooms, I can't speak to that. What I can speak to is, the Ukrainians post these videos on social media. They brag about torturing Russian civilians and Russian soldiers, killing them and torturing them, if not killing them. I did visit a former sausage factory in the Lugansk People's Republic that was used by the IDAR battalion from March 2014 till March 2020 as a prison in which prisoners were tortured. And also, I would just point to George Eliason, an American investigative journalist living in the Lugansk People's Republic. He has seen actual mass graves. He has seen pits. Now, I don't know the size, but there's an RT documentary featuring George where he's standing in one of them, and he says, like, within some minutes, we see skulls being excavated, heads were decapitated. So, and the Anna Soraka, who, I forget her official title, but she's a spokeswoman from the Lugansk People's Republic, and she has done in-depth investigations into Ukraine's war crimes against the people of the Lugansk People's Republic. And she can talk at length about these types of things, these crimes, these actual mass graves.
Well, I have to say something here, because this is one of the reasons why I appreciate so much your work, is that people usually say, oh, Eva Karene Bartlett is a Russian propagandist. If you were a Russian propagandist, you'd probably now answer to this question following a certain narrative, but you only speak about what you know, what you saw, what you witnessed. This is real journalism, and this is what people should pay attention to, because here in the EU, we find a lot of people that have never been to the ground and saying a lot of things like if it was facts. So thank you once again, Eva, for all that, for your honesty and for being a real journalist, trying to give us the details that no one else gives us. So it's actually very important. I have two more questions before we go. One is from one member of our audience, who is Daniel Alexandre. I don't know if you have any information of this, but since at least late July, early August, there was a CBS report about the armament that was actually being sent to other places, but not to the front battle. Do you have any information about this, about what happens to the weaponry that it should go to the Ukrainian army, but doesn't reach the target?
That's a great question. Again, I don't have an answer personally. I know I have seen things again on Telegram, most likely Telegram channels, saying like that these weapons are being resold on the black market or something, but that's just hearsay on my part. I don't have an answer directly. But yeah, just in reply to what you said, I wish I had the answer for everything. That would be a nice feeling. but my objective is never to be like a know-it-all, like, hey, I'm the expert on this. It's just to share what I can, what experience I have had. And being, as I was mentioning earlier, spending a lot of time in the Donbass since March this year, I've been there at very pivotal moments. So I mentioned the referendum, that was pivotal in a more positive way. But since you mentioned late July, you kind of jogged my memory, and we're talking about weapons. And the thing, that Western media has completely whitewashed, one of the many things, is Ukraine's use of these pedal mines, Lipostok mines, otherwise known as butterfly mines, firing them at the end of July via rockets, with each rocket containing over 300 of these things. And until now, they're still maiming Donbass civilians. I interviewed a 14-year-old boy who used to be a breakdancer and do mixed martial arts fighting, who lost his foot to one of these mines in early November, I believe it was. And so, this is a hideous war crime. I spoke earlier about not really having fear of many things. Okay, I'm afraid of spiders, but these mines are so insidious that they're terrifying, because I've said this many times in interviews. So again, to people who might have heard me elsewhere, I'm sorry for repeating myself, but it's really worth repeating, because I remember when I first saw them, and it was in the center of Donetsk the day after they were fired, like the morning after they were fired in night. And I was looking right at them and I couldn't see them because they blend in so well. And I just remember thinking, like, for weeks afterwards, even like when I left Donbass and back to Russia, I was like, oh, I don't need to look at my feet anymore, because that's how I was walking. I was walking, looking exactly where my feet were going, wouldn't step on anything that wasn't bare pavement. So, no leaves, no paper, nothing, because that's how well these mines blend in. And now 87 civilians have been maimed by them. And if you see some of the photos, I've shared some. One was a young person from Gorlivka. It's horrific, the way it blows your foot apart if you still have a foot left. So this is something, I know you have another question, but I just feel it's really important to emphasize that, Ukraine signed the Ottawa Treaty. It was supposed to destroy its alleged 6 million stock of them. The best I could find is that it destroyed maybe 2 million of them. Definitely, these mines were fired in rockets sent by Ukraine, not by Russia. It's illogical. When the Western propagandists say this, Russians are in Donbass. Why would they put these mines where they themselves will be injured? It's just illogical. On the other hand, who benefits from them? Ukraine, it has been killing civilians since 2014. They have no problem using this sadistic method as well. So that's my little rant.
I suggest to people to watch and read the reports by the United Nations Human Rights Commission, which actually emphasizes all the persecution that Russian-speaking citizens faced in Ukraine. But you have to go back to the years of 2014, 2015, 2016, as well as the OSCE reports, especially in the last weeks before the start of the special military operation. But yes, I have one more question. But before that, last week, the president of Nigeria said that the Boko Haram and other armed groups in Nigeria are being armed with weapons coming from Ukraine. Why didn't anyone took this statement by the president of Nigeria? So it's not John Doe from Nigeria, it's actually from the president. But my last question will be, which are your next projects? What can we expect from Eva Karene Bartlett in the future?
Well, I'm finishing off some projects from my last visit to the Donbass. So, it's already been done, but I haven't done it myself. That's like, for example, putting out Mariupol rebuilding scenes, because the narrative, of course, is that Russia just went to Mariupol and bombed the hell out of the city for the heck of it. It's just like, well, no, there's context. Again, as I said earlier, not all the destruction was due precisely to Russia. Some of it was, but then there's the context of what was being fought, namely Azov and Ukrainian forces. And just with that Western talking point, like, oh, look what Russia did to Mariupol. They did the same thing. The Western media did the same thing regarding Aleppo and Homs. Who is left to rebuild? It's, in the case of Syria, obviously it's Syria and its allies. In the case of Mariupol and elsewhere, Volnovakha, it's Russia rebuilding. It's Russia providing humanitarian aid. So whereas there are many videos out there on Telegram, etc., I still do when I get some other projects done, I will be putting a video out of what I've seen in terms of reconstruction in Mariupol. I'm currently working on finishing subtitling a video of interviews I did with refugees in Anapa. Most of the refugees that I met there were from Kherson Oblast. So it was very interesting. The reason I wanted to speak with them is kind of twofold, because the Western talking points are that Russia is kidnapping Ukrainians and holding them in dire conditions. And people I spoke with, they evacuated because they were warned they should evacuate. But for example, one young woman I spoke with said her mom is still there. She didn't want to leave. She didn't want to leave her home and her dogs. And she said, even though Russia offered, to evacuate the dogs as well, the woman just didn't want to leave her home. So that in itself contradicts this narrative that people are being kidnapped, because if they were being kidnapped, that woman would be in Anapa right now. And the other thing is that these people are not being held in dire conditions. The first people I met, including this woman, they were staying in a pretty nice hotel, being hosted by, I don't know who in Anapa, the town council or whatever, but they're being hosted in these hotels. They're not being forced to stay. They can come and go as they wish. The second group of people I met, or rather the second location in Anapa I went to, it was more like a very not 5-star, but like a 3-star seaside resort complex. With apparently 50 residential buildings, a swimming complex, laundromat, a gym where I saw men working out, a detski sad, a children's, a kindergarten, and people were free to come and go. There was a one building that was like an administrative building where people could get and if you're familiar with Russian bureaucracy, it can be pretty difficult to navigate. So imagine you are fresh here and you need to get all this paperwork. Normally you'd have to go to various buildings, maybe far out of your way. All this is in one centralized building. So people can get everything from registering marriage to getting a housing certificate, which enables them to buy, or a land certificate, whatever, that enables them to buy a house or a place of residence, to getting their passport, everything in this one location. And I'm still, as I said, subtitling this video, but it was pretty interesting. Each person is given 10,000 rubles upon crossing into the Russian Federation. Families from high risk areas in Kherson are given 100,000 per person. So I mean, there's a lot. I probably am forgetting some things, but a lot of positive things about their situation. Their situation in Kherson was not a good situation, obviously, but what I saw definitely contradicts the Western narrative. And, speaking of parallels with Syria, I heard the same thing when people were being evacuated from Rukban camp in the southeast of Syria. Western media at that time in 2018 or 2019 were like, oh, they're being taken to dire situations in Homs and they're being held at gunpoint and some people have been killed. And I remember I went and I interviewed people that were being evacuated from Rukban. Number one, they blamed the local bandits and some of the terrorist groups that were occupying Rukban. They blamed the Americans for not allowing them to leave, for preventing them from leaving. They blamed these terrorist mafia factions for holding all the food, which is common. Is what happened in eastern Aleppo, it happened in Madaya, it happened in eastern Ghouta, that whenever there was food sent in, it was not the civilians who had access to it. Anyway, my point being, at the time, I also emailed 2 different UN representatives who had seen the facilities where these refugees were being held, these IDPs were being held, and they were like, no, it's totally fine. Nobody's being killed, nobody's being held at gunpoint. So it's the same narrative, the same kind of BS narrative that I feel is important to expose. I have some other things from my last trip to the DPR. So I want to finish those off. I will be going back. I'm not going to say exactly when, but in the near future. And in the distant future, a project I've put off for far too long, I do want to start writing about my experiences in Palestine, Syria, and Donbass. Actual writing is in book form. So that's a project down the road.
It seems quite a lot of interesting projects that you have. Many people also noticed the DPR flag you have right there on your right. Yeah. So they saluted. Yes, it's quite, they noticed it. Yes, there you go. And by the way, 2 days ago, the Sky News reporter in Kherson, I don't know if you watched this video, she was in Kherson and she asked the Ukrainians in Kherson, how was the situation now? Better or worse than when the Russians were there? And the lady promptly answered, worse, because now the help, the support doesn't come to everyone here. And back then, it wasn't like that. It was way much different. But thank you so much, Eva Karene Bartlett, for being here with us today. It was a pleasure. It was an honor for us because to have you here and share your insight on the ground, on all your experience. And all my audience really appreciate this, and it will be a video that will be available on my channel. And soon we will add also the subtitles, not only in English, but in Portuguese and in Russian as well, in order to allow other viewers to have access.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you so much for having me on. Thank you for your generous words, and thank you also. You're a fantastic interviewer. You brought a lot to the conversation. I want to make one tiny point about the flag, because I know there's going to be detractors saying, "Oh, no credible journalist would ever blah blah blah." Okay, number one, you find Western credible journalists in Kiev or Lviv literally standing with Nazi flags. This flag represents a people. It doesn't represent the government, for me at least. It represents the people. And for me, when I go to a place, whether it's Palestine or Donbass or Syria, and I meet with people who are suffering as a direct result of policies of my governments, Canada, America, and other Western governments, it's very moving. I bond with the people. It becomes, in a sense, my own struggle, even though I'm not from these regions. And so this is personal for me as well, this flag. The other point I want to make is that in 2017, one of these smears, this woman named Agnes Gruda, she around the same time as Snopes and everybody else was smearing me back then, she did an article on me, and she did the same thing, like no credible journalist would, because I had a Syria bracelet with the flag of Syria, not the flag of the Free Syrian Army, but the flag of the country of Syria. And for the same reason, because Syria is very dear to me, and the flag represents to me the people that I am supporting, the people I want to have peace, etc. And so she's like, "Oh, no credible journalist would ever wear that." So I'm like, okay, I'm going to do a rebuttal to your little smear on me, which was actually quite a lengthy rebuttal. I can share that if folks want. But the funniest thing was, I go on Jihadi Agnes's Facebook page, and I find her in Libya holding the AK-47 of a terrorist. And I'm like, all right, then, I think we're done. So
pretty neutral. Probably they were expecting you now to add the Ukrainian flag to your profile. Maybe that way you would be seen as neutral and impartial. But in the end, that Donetsk Republic flag is a symbol of self-determination. And most people don't understand the concept, but it's a symbol of self-determination. Eva Karene Bartlett, thank you so much once again for everything. I will finish now the stream, but I just want then afterwards to say goodbye to you more personally. Thank you everyone for joining us here today. I thought that it was a very important interview with Eva Karene Bartlett. She brought so many questions for reflection and so many interesting points for us to reflect. So I wish you a good day and see you next time. Tomorrow we will have an interview with Igor Yushkov about the economic situation in Russia. He's a member of the Russian International Affairs Council. So I hope you guys enjoy this interview tomorrow. See you next time. Bye-bye. Okay, so the stream already ended.